talk about those examples that were in the slideshow for what you could do with JavaScript in the early days. We said you could make a calculator. You could click a button and it would put a number in a text field. You could put a plus inside the text field, etc. And then you could press enter with your mouse and it would make a calculation. You could do form validation. When someone enters crap in a form and submits it, JavaScript could look at the values that were submitted, check them against some rules, and see whether it was valid input. You could do horrible mystery meat mouse over navigation, where when you moved your mouse over something, an image changed from one thing to another. All of these things follow this pattern. When something happens, do something else. So JavaScript, a lot of the JavaScript code we'll write is event-driven. The event is something that happens on the page. And when that happens, we want to react to the event. When they submit a form, check the values they entered. When they click the button, make some calculations. When they move their mouse over a thing, change the image to something else. So this is a lot of what we're going to do, especially this week. So when something happens, that part is an event. We do something else. So what we need to do is start listening for that event to occur. And tell JavaScript that when that event finally does occur, run this function over here. So that's what a lot of our early code is going to be. Listening for events to occur and then doing something when they do. I'm going to create something on CodePen. CodePen is a pretty cool site where you can create HTML, CSS, and JavaScript projects in a really easy way and have them render right here on the page. So you can have the code and the actual running version side by side. And even cooler, on a paid account, you have something called Professor Mode. So I'm going to copy this link into Slack. And you can actually see this example running on your machines. You can even scroll independently of me, and you can copy and paste the code right out of there. So it's not just screen sharing. You can actually get to the text and copy and paste it if you want to save a copy. And we'll put a link to it in the notes for today, too. It's going to be pretty simple. But it's a pretty cool way just to do quick examples. So I'm going to use it a fair amount throughout the 3 weeks. So let's just do something really simple. Who knows HTML to some degree? Nearly everybody. All right, let's make a very simple HTML document. And actually, when you do it in CodePen, you don't need the HTML element or the head element or the body element. You just start writing the body. So let's do that. Let's make ourselves a paragraph. What's this thing I've written here? Yeah, it's a paragraph, but what do we call that angle bracket, something angle bracket? Say it again. That's a tag, right? What's that? It's a closing tag. They're both tags. What do we call this and everything in it? That's an element. So our tags represent elements of a page in HTML. What do we call it when I write things like this? Say that one more time, Celine. Attribute, that's right. Listen to your friend Celine. She's cool. She knows what she's talking about. An attribute and its value. And we generally double quote the values, although if there aren't any spaces in it, you don't strictly have to. And single quotes work just as well, but most people use double quotes, so we like consistency of style, so we're going to use double quotes around our attribute values. So we've got ourselves a very simple paragraph here. And let's make a button. Between the opening and closing button tags, we'll put the text that we want to appear in the button element. By the way, everything between the opening and closing tags, we would call the content of that element. And it can just be text. It can be other elements nested as deeply as you want. It can be a combination of both. Yeah.
Just for syntax's sake, so that's the content of the element.
Mm-hmm.
So would everything from the opening tag to the closing tag itself be considered the element?
Yes. Okay. Yep. Everything from the opening tag to the ending tag would be that element, including all of its contents. Now I've zoomed in so dang far I can't even see the stuff here. All right, and it's rendering right on the page there. So we said we want this to happen. When something happens, do something else. So we need to listen for that something to happen. So we can just write some JavaScript right over here. So what do we want? Suppose we want to listen for that button to get clicked. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. So first we have to find the button. We have to grab it. A few ways we could do that. Since we're in the modern world, HTML5 and everything, we can do document. That represents the entire DOM, or the document object model, which is how the page is represented within the browser. It takes your HTML, it parses it, and it creates the DOM, the object model that represents the contents of the page. If you screw up your HTML, it'll do its best to create the DOM anyway. So document is how we get to that. And we said back in the horrible old days, there was document.all and document layers. Not anymore. We have much better ways to get to stuff now, including document.querySelector. Anybody used this before? So this is how we grab something out of the DOM. We pass it a string. A string representing what?
A string representing the element.
Representing the element, how we identify it from everything else. The string takes the form of a selector, a CSS selector. So we can use the same format that we would in CSS to target an element. The easiest way, just the name of the element, the type of element that it is. And what this would do is find the very first matching element. So the selector P would match every single paragraph on the page. When we pass that to query selector, it just gives us the first one.
So there is a dot selector?
Say again?
So is there a document dot selector that would select every element P?
Query selector all finds all the matches, and it returns an array-like thing. Not strictly speaking an array, it's called a node list, but it's array-like. You can use square brackets to get to the stuff in it. But right now, there's only one button, and that's what we want. I didn't mean the paragraph anyway, I meant the button, right? All right, great. Let's save it to a variable. Wait, Uncle Dave, you said variable. Why did you write const? Because I like to confuse you. No, because we're in ES6 land. And in ES6 land, we make variables a little differently. In the old days, you would say var. There are some problems with var and the way that it's scoped. So ES6 introduced two new keywords, let and const. The difference is not that consts are truly constants. The difference between the two is that a variable created with const cannot be reassigned. You can't suddenly say btn equals something else, but you can mutate it. You can change some of the values in it as long as you don't do it by actually using the equal sign again and reassigning it. So our rule for writing ES6 is going to be this. Use const unless you know for sure that you can't. And it's very rare that you can't. and we'll encounter some situations when you would have to use let instead. But as a rule, we are just not going to use var anymore. We will talk more about the real difference between var and these once we get deeper into functions, probably tomorrow. For right now, just use const unless you know for sure that you need let. And it's fairly rare. Celine, did you have a question? Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll see. Sometimes we really do have to reassign something. An example would be a counter for a loop. So when you create I inside the parentheses for a for loop, you definitely need to use let because it's going to get reassigned every time through. That's probably the first example we'll encounter. So for right now, we're saving the button to this const. You can actually check out the JavaScript console down here, still in CodePen. What if we just say console.log btn? Okay, and it shows us button click me. Yay, it really did it. Victory is ours. So we said when it didn't update. When the button is clicked, do something else, right? So we need to listen for that click. So here's how we do that. One way, kind of the old way, would be to take this element that we've grabbed. Now this is a real element. And access a property of that element called onClick. All lowercase like that. JavaScript is case sensitive. And then we could just set that to a function. It could be a function that we wrote and gave a name, or it could be a function that we write right here. Function. Say yeah. Yeah. And that simply does alert. Yeah. Cool. So then I could say button on click equals say yeah. Why didn't I write say yeah parentheses? Say again? So if we wrote say yeah parentheses, that would run it, right? That would run say yeah. Yeah. We don't want to run it. We just want to tell it that when this button is clicked, it should run it. We're not going to be the ones actually running it, right? So if we put parentheses here, yeah, then what would we be assigning onClick to? The return value of that function. Whatever that happens to be, which is a whole lot of nothing. We want the function itself. So functions in JavaScript are objects just like anything else, and we can pass them around, assign them to other, heck, we can assign them to variables. I could say const blah equals say yeah, and call blah parentheses. Yeah. Totally do that. And so we could assign a property of another object to the function itself. And because it's a non-click function, that means it's going to start listening for that click to occur on that element. And when that happens, it's going to run say yeah. Yes, Lynn.
Could we, instead of making a, like, I know that making a button would look nicer and be more organized, but could we just write alert, say yeah then, and it, like, do the same thing, or would it try to assign the return value of the alert?
So onClick has to be set to a function. You could write the function right there in line. It doesn't have to be a function that you've given a name. We'll see that in a second. But yeah, you can't just write the line, the expression that you want to run at the time. It has to be a function. Yeah.
Sorry. So one more time.
Never apologize for asking questions.
Yeah. So say yeah. So I understand say yeah with parentheses is going to return a value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an actual function invocation.
Invocation. So, but when you don't do that, then what is it doing with the function?
So if you just wrote say yeah on a line by itself,
Yeah.
nothing. It's just like running in. It's just like putting any variable name there. If you assign it to something though, Just like if say yeah happened to be a number, it would be assigning onClick to that number. It's just that say yeah, the variable say yeah represents an actual function.
So like after that line, maybe you'd be able to do like button.onClick parentheses something. That would work.
That is the idea. But in the case of onClick, that's a special property that actually starts listening for an event to occur. So that's not how we'll do it. But yeah, that is the idea exactly. Yeah.
If you put parentheses,
Todd.
after say yeah, it would run.
Yes. Yeah.
So when you set it, you gotta make sure you don't do that, right?
Right. So if we ran it, then it would run, and whatever the return value is would be what's on the right side of the equal sign, right? Which means that it's whatever the return value is that gets set to onClick. And the return value, we didn't return anything, so the return value is undefined. So we would set onClick to undefined, and clicking this wouldn't do a darn thing. Yeah. So we need to make sure it's the actual function itself that we're just treating like any other variable is what gets set to that onClick property, because then JavaScript takes care of it for us. It's now listening for this click to occur, and then it will execute that function when the time comes. So now we click, yeah, just like that. So we said it's like just assigning this to a variable. Could we literally do that? Could I, instead of writing that, say const say yeah equals function? Just comment that out. Alert. Oh, yeah. That's how we declare a variable, right? I could just set it to function with no name, anonymous function. That still work? Oh, yeah, it does. Uh-huh. I can do that. So if I could do that, could I also just not bother with either of those? Let's go ahead and just comment it out. What if the right side of the equal sign is just an anonymous function that we spell right? Not to set to onClick. So onClick must take an actual function object. Because remember, we're not the ones executing it. JavaScript's executing it for us when something else happens. And we will be doing this a trillion times in a trillion different contexts, which is why I'm emphasizing this so dang hard. The thing you set it to must not be a function execution, but an actual function. So if I do this, does that work? Really? Yeah, really. So if you just leave the name out, you have an anonymous function. And if you're never going to do anything else with that function ever again, if you're only going to, say, set it up as an event listener, maybe you don't even need to give it a name. But you might want to, if you want to make it clear to the person reading the code what it's supposed to do when you click, because that could be helpful. So one more quick example before we take a break, because we're about halfway through the morning. We could do this an entirely different way. Let's move this up here. Click is swell and all, but what if we want more than one thing to happen when you click? We want it to run more than one function. If I set onClick to another function, and then I set onClick to another function, guess what? I just completely reassigned the onClick property, and the other one got blown away. So maybe you just want to keep adding additional functions to run when something happens. I threw out the word event listener a moment ago. So that's what you call functions that run when an event occurs, which are an awful lot of the functions that we're going to be writing. So you call those event listeners. And there's another way to add them to an element. So our button here, just because it's an HTML node and they all do this, also has a function called add event listener. Camel case like that. Remember, JavaScript is case sensitive. Most of the time, things are camel cased. But remember, Brendan Ike wrote this whole thing in 10 days. So it wasn't the most consistent thing in the world the first time around. And because there's so much ancient JavaScript on the web, we really, really need that backwards compatibility. So occasionally, you'll see things that don't follow that rule. But anything added recently, and add event listener was added fairly recently, is going to be camel cased. So add event listener. And we need to pass it two things. First, a string to tell it what event we're listening for. In this case, click. There are a whole bunch of different events we can listen for. Second argument, the function to run. So if we get our say yeah function assigned to a variable, and we just pass in say yeah, oh yeah. When you see it in this context, maybe it's a little more obvious that you don't execute this, right? You actually have the function itself as a variable, and you pass a variable as an argument to another function. Yes, that variable happens to hold a function, but that's what we want to do, because we want to say, when click happens, say yeah. We're not saying yeah. We're telling it that when that click occurs, you should say yeah for us. Our voices are getting tired. We've been yapping all morning. We don't have time to say yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Roy.
So when click button is clicked, then say yeah function will take place.
Will run, yep. Yep, so it will do the actual execution for us. It will essentially throw those parentheses on there.
And add event listener itself is a function.
Yes, add event listener is a function that is built in to every HTML element. So we can call that on anything. So it has to know, if we're going to set up an event listener, it needs to know three things. What object the event is going to occur on, what the event is. So button tells it what object it's going to occur on. Click is what the event is. And three, what should I do when that happens? And that has to be a function. But again, we could have just written an anonymous function right in here like this. That might be ugly. You might get used to it, but you can totally do it. Just like I can say the string click in here, or I could have said const event equals the string click and said event. No different. No different than being able to do either an actual function in line here or a variable that holds a function. Same thing. Just passing arguments to functions.
What would happen if we give a parameter and say yeah?
Good question. What if say yeah needed to take an argument? Excellent question. We'll deal with that later. But very good question, and we will answer it. Yes, Lynn. Yeah. So I've added an event listener. So now that's something that's going to happen when we click. I can add another event listener. Oh, yeah. Cuss, yeah. Click. Oh, yeah. Cuss, yeah. Both things happen. So I'm just adding one more event listener. So any event listeners that were already there are still there. But when I actually assign the onClick property, I'm completely reassigning it to whatever function is on the right side of that equal sign. So anything that was there before gets blown away. And onClick just equals that one function. Most of the time, as long as we're doing vanilla JavaScript without any libraries, we're going to use @EventListener because it's just better. And it feels a little better too. Let your conscience be your guide. Any more questions right this second? Yeah.
I just had a small question, so I think it refers more to the HTML side of what, at least with this specific thing.
Sure.
So we don't have to keep going back. How would you feel like you focus on a button? Is what we would do. So you could just click the enter instead of having to click it the whole time.
Okay, so there are a few ways you can do that. You could just, when the page loads, you could probably just say button.focus, call a function called focus on it. That'll just focus it. See, it's highlighted in blue now. Yeah, you could do that, but there are better ways to make it so the inner will do that. And we'll address those yet today. Any other questions? Okay, we're about halfway through the morning, so go ahead and take a 10-minute break and be back rejuvenated and ready to rock and roll.